President Putin must be sitting in the Kremlin, trembling that the Americans can do this. But this is an operation that's been in the planning for a long, long time.
US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the United States overnight strikes in Iran as part of Operation Midnight Hammer were successful and completely obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities in a press conference we just brought you live from the Pentagon. But a senior Iranian source told Reuters that Iran was able to move most of its highly enriched uranium from the Fordo nuclear site ahead of the strike. And Iranian authorities have not confirmed the extent of the damage at any of the 3 nuclear facilities that were hit. So just how crippling were these strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities, and could Iran still develop a nuclear weapon? Well, joining us now is Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What do we actually know about the damage sustained at those 3 nuclear facilities that were hit? Gulf states are monitoring their environments for signs of any nuclear radiation.
Well, firstly, if they're hit, one wouldn't expect to see any nuclear radiation. Blowing up uranium, however enriched it is, would not create a nuclear chain reaction and hence an explosion. You're likely to get some residues, probably uranium hydrofluoride, which is a sort of chemical, and a few other bits and pieces. So don't expect any radiation. I think this is, obviously we're used to President Trump and some of his advisors using hyperbole to sort of describe some of these things. But this seems to be a very, very comprehensive operation. Mm-hmm. If I was the Iranians and I had set up a nuclear weapons program, I can't see how it survived in any form at all. You said the Iranians said they moved highly enriched uranium out of Fordo. Well, we know how comprehensive the intelligence network is, the Israeli intelligence network on the ground. I'm sure they would have seen that if it was done. And some skepticism about the battle damage assessment. The mood music very much coming out of the Pentagon. It's been successful. And I know that these massive ordnance penetrators haven't been used before. Like Sean, I was in the Gulf Wars and I saw some of these bombs drop pretty close and they're pretty horrific, certainly if you were on the ground. And the technical spec we know of the MOPS, if they've dropped 3 or 4 of these on Fordo, I wouldn't have thought very much remains of it. So on the face of it, I for once agree with President Trump and his close advisors that the Iranian nuclear program probably has been obliterated, certainly for the next few years. And we will see what happens. But this is not a Chernobyl. This is not a Fukushima. There should be very little radiation if these places have been hit properly. If
the Iranian regime was successful in moving some of that enriched uranium, how easy is it to track? Is it a substance that will give off enough radiation for it to be tracked remotely? Does it need special storage facilities? How easy would it be for authorities to be able to track it and destroy the rest of it?
Well, I think 2 things here, Alex. First of all, moving uranium, moving nuclear isotopes around, what are you trying to achieve there? You need quite a lot of this stuff and you need it highly enriched so that it can be used as a bomb. We're pretty certain that the uranium has been enriched to 60%. It needs to be 95 to be bomb viable. And they don't have that. So moving it around. When it comes to detection, certainly radiological isotopes are easy to detect because they give off radiation. However, the alpha emitters that you get from uranium and what comes out of it is very easily shielded. Actually, your skin will keep out a lot of uranium. So they could shield it in a box with lead, whatever it is, and it would be quite difficult to detect with the sort of monitors and sensors that the Americans and others might have up in the sky around the place. But I think a lot of the intelligence that the Israelis, the Americans are relying on in Iran is what we call human intelligence and signals intelligence. That is spies on the ground. That is signals intelligence listening to their communications. And I think one of the incredibly impressive things about the American operation is that they've done it. Their operational security was completely watertight. They've done this operation with nobody knowing it. And I think you put the converse, I think they've got a pretty good idea what's happening in Iran. So if it was moved, I expect they would know. But I don't, from a building a nuclear weapon type issue, I really don't see what they'd get from moving it around.
Were you surprised listening to that press conference that from what we were given to understand by General Dan Kane, that there was no Iranian fighters engaging with the bombers, no surface-to-air engagement at all? It seems that they were completely undetected, reaching their target. Is that much of a surprise?
Well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, it's a hell of a statement. President Putin must be sitting in the Kremlin, trembling that the Americans can do this. But this is an operation that's been in the planning for a long, long time. We heard also there were 70 cruise missiles fired from submarines and other military vehicles that would have taken out any air defense that's around, that would have nullified any electronic communication the Iranians might have. And the Iranian Air Force really, it has been pretty much obliterated itself, not just in this attack, but previously. But I think it really shows, when we talk about escalation and what the Iranians can do next, I'm pretty pushed to think of what they could do, because their military is, of a different technical age to the Americans. And it's difficult to know what they could do. If the Americans can drop 14 of these massive bombs, travel thousands and thousands of miles and back again without the Iranians knowing about it, they must be thinking, crikey, what on earth can we do? And if the Americans decide to step it up, then that would be a real worry. So I think this is a real marker. Let's hope it's the end of the Iranian weapons program. And, let's hope we can negotiate a peace as soon as possible. And people can focus back on Ukraine, which, of course, from a UK's perspective, that is our greatest threat. And while we're all looking in the Middle East, Putin is cracking on in Ukraine.
There were several questions to the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth on whether or not this is another case where the US has opened, let's say, a can of worm where you have one of those never-ending engagements of US troops. He was very adamant that this is not open-ended and that Donald Trump had given clear instruction that the US was only interested in bringing to an end Iran's nuclear capabilities. Do you think he's right in that? Or do you think that there is a danger that this is basically the beginning of yet another never-ending engagement of American forces in the Middle East?
Well, like you, I expect, and me and the rest of the world, let's hope not. This is not Iraq 2003. This is not looking for WMDs.
But sorry to interrupt you, but it's very similar rhetoric coming from the then President Bush of saying this is not a long-term engagement. This is just getting rid of the weapons of mass destruction, which you've just mentioned, essentially selling the idea to the American people that this is an in and out operation. We're just going to get rid of these dangerous weapons and we'll be gone. And of course, we all know what happened afterwards.
Yeah, a fair point. My point being is there is actually WMD there. And the way that it's been done in 2003, there was a massive invasion and ground troops. They didn't have the capability to do this. So at the moment, this is a precision strike, as it's designated. And if it's done the job, then fine. I cannot see that that the Americans and its allies would put troops on the ground to extend this even further. So I get your point, but I don't. I think this is very different from 2003 and even 1991. So yeah, if they haven't completely destroyed the nuclear capability, which I sort of think they probably have, they might go back again. And it depends what Iran tries to do in retaliation. But as I've said, I'm not really sure now that Hezbollah and the other proxies that Iran has are so denuded in capability. I'm not entirely sure what they can do.
And just finally, there was a question at the end of that press conference asking about intelligence. We saw earlier this week that it was Tulsi Gabbard, who's in charge of the US intelligence agencies, who said earlier in the year that, according to US intelligence services, Iran was not looking to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, it seems that Donald Trump has disregarded that advice. So Pete Hegseth was asked on what intelligence the US was taking these decisions to bomb those 3 nuclear facilities. But answer came none from the defense secretary. He says that Donald Trump looked at all the information and made that decision. Is it usual not to be told where the intelligence came from? And is it worrying that Donald Trump is not reliant on intelligence coming from his own intelligence services?
Well, yes, a lot of questions there. I mean, first of all, is it usual to not know where the intelligence comes from? Well, yes, it is usual, and certainly in the intelligence world, sources are absolutely fundamental, because if you know the source, then that source can be attacked. What I would refer listeners to is actually the Iranians themselves about 2 weeks ago said that they had enriched uranium beyond 60%. Once you have enriched uranium beyond 60%, it's a relatively straightforward, in inverted commas, task then to turn that into weaponized uranium. So I am assuming maybe that is what the president saw and decided to act on it. And his security leader sort of backed him up again. But yeah, I think that to me is absolutely the main thing, that they were very close to having weaponized uranium, and presumably that was the precursor that allowed Trump to deploy his forces to destroy it.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for giving us your time. Really good to speak. A commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear Regiment and NATO's Rapid Reaction Battalion.